Morning glory and evening grace, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt inside the Beltway. Welcome. I'm breaking a lot of my rules this half hour. One of my rules is never have on someone who's way smarter than me, and Alan Dershowitz is. Never have on someone who's taught con law longer than me, and Alan Dershowitz has. And never have on an author of a book that I haven't read, and his brand new book, The Preventive State, has not caught up with me yet. But I know what it's about, so I'm going to ask him good questions. Professor Dershowitz, welcome. Congratulations on The Preventive State. We need this book. I want the answers in this book. So I'm going to begin with the simple question. What's going to shock me the most in The Preventive State?
That it's not political, that you wouldn't know reading the book whether I supported or opposed Biden or Trump or Kamala Harris. You wouldn't know whether I was a liberal or a conservative, a Republican or a Democrat. It's a book for all people who care about the future of our country. It's a book about how we are quietly and without any kind of debate moving toward a preventive state in which the government has the power to do things they've never had before based on artificial intelligence and our ability to predict cataclysmic events. And they're doing it for all good purposes. They're doing it to prevent the spread of disease, to prevent nuclear proliferation, to prevent terrorism, to prevent the kinds of killings we saw in the District of Columbia of these two young people. We're doing it for all the best purposes, but we're doing it in a way that threatens our civil liberties unless we construct a jurisprudence, a way of thinking about this. We know that it's better to acquit 10 guilty people than to convict even one innocent person. But we don't know whether it's better to detain 10 innocent people in order to prevent 9/11 or Israel's October 7th or Pearl Harbor. We don't have a jurisprudence of prevention. And after 60 years of thinking about it and teaching it and writing about it, I finally decided to write what I consider my magnum opus, my most important book, The Preventive State. But you wouldn't know that it was an important book because the New York Times has refused to review any of my books since I defended Trump. Harvard University won't allow me to speak since I defended Trump. Um, no liberal media will interview me or cover me because I'm now a defender of Donald Trump, even though I didn't vote for him the first two times, but because I defended his constitutional rights against an unconstitutional impeachment, I am absolutely canceled by the liberal
Yeah.
media, the New
Da-
York Times, CNN, you name it.
David Mamet was on the program yesterday about his brand new book,
Friend of
and
mine,
he's lost
good
a
friend
lot
of
of
mine.
friends. Yeah, well,
Yeah.
David's lost a lot of friends because he says good things about Trump. He didn't defend Trump the way you did, but he said good things about Trump. I want to start, Professor Dershowitz, with a question I posed at his dining room table to Mark Zuckerberg when he invited a half dozen conservative pundits to come break bread with him. I said, Mark, can you predict who's going to be a school shooter? And he looked at me like, what? Like Minority Report? And I said, yeah, if you get enough data, this is before AI was a big deal, probably 6, 7 years ago. So if you get enough data together, can't you find a pattern that would suggest this individual who's on the internet, because they all leave trails, is going to be a school shooter? And he told me, no, I can't. Well, I think now we can, Professor. What do we do if we can?
Well, we have what are called red flag laws now, which are based on our ability to predict who the shooters will be. And we have a lot of false positives. We deny guns to people who would not use them improperly in order to prevent even one school shooting. So we're going to make mistakes. We're going to have either false positives or negatives. A false positive is when you say a person is going to do it and you do something to him and he won't do it. A false negative is when you say, oh, he won't do it, and then he does it and we regret it horribly. So we're going to have those mistakes. And our question is how to balance those mistakes. I'll give you an example from history, the best example from history, and it's very central to my book. And I think a lot about this. 1935, Great Britain and France could have invaded Germany and prevented the Holocaust and prevented 50 million people from dying. In fact, Goebbels thought they would because he and the Nazis were violating the Versailles Treaty. But the British and the French decided no, Hitler was really not as bad as people thought he was. So we're not going to do it. We're going to let them arm. We're going to let them be stronger. As the result of that false negative, 50 million people were killed. If Churchill had been the prime minister, he would have invaded of Germany, and then he'd have been relegated to the bowels of history, saying he was a warmonger, he killed 10,000 people, it was needless, Hitler was never going to do any of these things. The problem with predicting is that science is blind to the future. And Mark, who I remember from college, Mark Zuckerberg, and I've met him since, is a brilliant guy, and he will be part of the ability to predict. We're not going to predict perfectly, but we will have a much better basis for predicting than we ever had before. And as the result, we'll make mistakes, but we'll make hopefully fewer mistakes.
So you cited the nostrum. It's actually a maxim that it is better to acquit 10 guilty than convict one innocent. I first heard that from a guy named Jerry Israel, who you may or may not have known. He taught me criminal pro at Michigan. And Jerry Israel, I
Yeah.
think if he said it once, he said it 25 times. And so deeply
Yeah.
embedded in me, and I get it. But we were dealing then with handguns and murders and things like that, not weapons of mass destruction you're mentioned in
Right.
the publicity materials for the book. Does that change the standard when we're dealing with WMD and toxins and viruses?
Of course it does. First, number one, don't believe what Professor Israels or Professor Yale Camisar or Professor Alan Dershowitz read to you from Blackstone. We never believed that it was better for 10 guilty to go free than for
Huh.
one innocent to be wrongly confined. We said it, but we never believed it. Juries don't act that way. Prosecutors don't act that way. We don't want 10 murderers on the street. We're prepared to convict a couple of innocent people to prevent murders. So we never really abided by that. But surely we can't abide by that in the age of a nuclear catastrophe. And we don't. After 9/11, we certainly didn't abide by that. We tortured people, we confined them, we made a lot of mistakes. In order to prevent another 9/11. If we could have prevented the first 9/11 by horribly detaining people. Look, we had an experience with this once after Pearl Harbor, which could have been prevented, but it wasn't. We didn't have the right use of intelligence. What did Roosevelt do? He put 110,000 innocent Japanese uh, people of Japanese descent into camps, not concentration camps or death camps, but they were still camps. And those were all false positives. They wouldn't have committed, maybe one or two of them would have committed treason or espionage, but certainly nothing to justify that kind of mass reaction. So what happens is we wait. We have the false negative, we wait, the event occurs, and then we overreact. And so we're wrong on both sides of the equation. We don't do enough before, and we do too much after.
I'm sure you can probably even do it in Latin. I'm sure you remember Cicero's maxim in war, the laws are silent. Are we in war all the time now, Professor? Are we, well, now that there is no abroad, now that we have hypersonic missiles, are we always at war?
We are always at war. And not only are we at war, but our allies are at war. Look at Israel. They're at war 24/7, and they fell into the same trap that we've just talking about with Pearl Harbor. They didn't do enough to prevent October 7th. It was a disaster, the worst intelligence disaster in modern history, not preventing October 7th. And now maybe people are arguing Israel is overreacting. Maybe they're doing too much. But that's inevitable. That happens. Every country does that. I can't think of a single example in history where a country was unprepared, allowed a disaster to occur, which could have been prevented, and then overreacted after the fact. That's why we need to construct a jurisprudence to tell us how to balance the mistakes on either side. We're doing it wrong because we haven't really thought it through. I've been thinking about this now for 60 years. I was teaching prevention for 60 years, and law schools haven't caught up. They don't teach it, they don't think about it. Yeah, you mentioned the movie Minority Report. That's the closest we've ever come to having a major public debate on this issue of prevention. I'm hoping my book, The Preventive State, will stimulate a debate, at least among academic colleagues. I don't think it will. I'll give you an example. I sent 100 copies of this book to every single member of the law school faculty at Harvard, every single member, the dean, the president of the university. I have not gotten a single response because I defended Trump. People aren't writing to me. People aren't going to read my book. This is one of the most important books written about the law in modern times. In not only my view, but you read some of the blurbs of Stephen Breyer.
Stephen
Uh,
Breyer. Stephen
yeah,
Breyer blurbed your
Larry.
book.
He introduced it. Larry Summers blurbed my book. Ed Erwin Chemerinsky. They all thought it was a very important book, but the Harvard Law School faculty doesn't want to have anything to do with me because I
Stand by,
defended
Professor. We're going to go to break. I'm going to talk to you during the break. I'm going to bring you back after the break. We'll put it all on YouTube as well because I think it's the toughest problem. And Professor Dershowitz is perhaps the greatest civil rights authority that we've got out there talking. So I'm going to milk the cow. Stay tuned. So, Professor, during this time, which will go on to YouTube, and I might use it in hour 3 if we've got time, I want to ask you about Brandenburg test. I don't think it works anymore because of the fact that
I agree with you.
okay, so what do we replace it with? You know what it is, I know what it is, my audience knows what it is because I've taught them it. What do we replace it with?
We replace it with a looser definition of incitement. You can incite, it doesn't have to be one-on-one incitement. Under Brandenburg, it has to be me talking to you basically and saying, go out and kill somebody. If you get somebody in front of a crowd saying, globalize the Intifada, Palestine should be free of Jews from the river to the sea, there's a real argument that those can incite the kind of killings that we saw in the District of Columbia. That's a debate worth having.
And have you seen any indication from SCOTUS that they're moving that way? Because they got stuck in a rut because of Justice Kennedy, and God bless him, but it was Justice Kennedy who messed up the jurisprudence over war prisoners who were being detained at Gitmo. Do you think that the court can get out of the rut?
I do. I think this Supreme Court is very pragmatic. Kavanaugh, Barrett, Gorsuch, they're very pragmatic. And I think the other two are a little ideological, but they're ideological, I think, perhaps on the right side on this issue. So I think they can get out of this rut. I think we're going to see the first movement is going to be a limitation on New York Times versus Sullivan. Now, that's going to be the malice requirement that judges decide whether there's malice or not is, I hope, going to be thrown out. I'm bringing such a case, so I'm hoping that will happen. I worked
That
on New
will
York
that
Times.
will itself be part of the preventive state. It will prevent a lot of incendiary rhetoric, which will in turn fuels incendiary acts. I mean, if we just cut it back a little bit, you're working on the preventative state, aren't you?
Yeah, and this comes from somebody who worked on New York Times versus Sullivan. I was one of the law clerks that helped
Oh, I
write
didn't know.
one of the opinions in New York Times versus Sullivan, and now I regret how it's been applied.
Were you a Fortis clerk? Who did you clerk for?
Arthur Goldberg, who was on the court before
Goldberg.
Fortas.
You're a Goldberg clerk. There aren't many of you because Johnson talked him off of the court.
Yeah, there are only 6 of us. Steve Breyer is one of them as well.
Oh, no kidding. Oh, that's real inside baseball. I'll play that in hour 3. Stand by, Professor. We're going to come back on to the national show, and we'll talk more about the preventative state. Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Professor Alan Dershowitz is being generous with his time. His brand new book is The Preventative State. The Preventative State is available at Amazon, at Barnes & Noble, every bookstore that's online, every bookstore in America, probably most airports in America. And the Preventative State asks the question, what are we going to do to stop serious harm? Now, Professor Dershowitz, you have seen and I have seen what happened to the young 2 Jews in D.C. last week, murdered at close range by a fanatic from Chicago who knew what he was doing and went to the Capitol Jewish Museum. I bet you we could have predicted that, but we might also have predicted that the other people in his radical fringe group and the members of Antifa are going to do violent things. How do you change the law to deal with the mortal lock, as we used to say in the horse betting business, of someone doing violence?
Well, not only could it have been predicted, but in my book, The Preventive State, I actually predicted it. I predicted it in 2 of my books. This book, and also I wrote a book called The Palestinianism. And I predicted it. And I predicted it based on my experience. I defended a lot of protesters during the Vietnam War, and some of them were violent. And some of the violent ones turned into murderers. Kathy Boudin became a murderer, murdered 2 policemen. The Weathermen became murderers. They planted bombs that killed people. So when you tolerate and encourage, the way, for example, the Harvard Divinity School and Public Health School encourage violent actions against Jews and against Israel, when you encourage that, when you tolerate students kidnapping two janitors at Columbia University, you're going to see the move from this kind of violence to going out and getting a gun and killing. It's going to happen. I got an honorary degree last week from a small college in Florida. The security people, this is the day after the killing in DC, the security people came over to me and said, "Sorry, Professor Dershowitz, but we have to give you a route to escape. We will have extra guards and they will have bulletproof shields to protect you because we're worried that there could be copycat attempts to get at you the way they killed these two people." So, and by the way, it's always the case. They come for the Jews first, but they're never the last. We're always the canary in the mine shaft. And when you start killing, and by the way, one of the people killed in this company wasn't Jewish. He was a very religious evangelical Christian. But when
Yes.
you go after Jews and start killing them, Christians come next.
Well, let me close this way. The Preventative State. I'm going to read it as soon as it arrives. I want to get you back in June after I've had a chance to digest it and talk professorial level stuff with you when I've read your case study. But in terms of the rule, I always like a black letter law. I teach con law students. I try and teach them how to pass the bar.
Right.
What do you think the black letter law is going to end up having to be about imminent threat and detention?
I think if you see imminent threats, there's going to be a constitutional right to detain. I think we're going to begin to err on the side of security a little bit more. You know, as Ben Franklin said, we shouldn't give up a lot of liberty for a little bit of security, but you have to give up a little bit of liberty for a lot of security. And the thesis of the preventive state is to try to decide exactly how much liberty, how much non essential liberty are we prepared to give up in order to prevent how many cataclysmic events that we could prevent, but we're not preventing now. Could we have prevented 9/11? Yes. Could we have prevented Pearl Harbor? Yes, but at a cost. And the question is, what is that cost and is it worth it? And that's what I argue in my book, The Preventive State.
Last question, Professor. We need a dialogue on this. We need a dialectic. Has any academic of any standing engaged you yet on the preventative state? Because that's how you
No,
actually move forward.
yeah, and they won't. As long as I don't renounce Donald Trump, and as long as I proudly say I defended him the way John Adams defended the people who were accused of the Boston Massacre, as soon as I say that Trump's first impeachment was unconstitutional, and I'm happy I defended him, as long as I say that, academics will not engage me. They have canceled me, they ignore me. I wrote this book for history. Maybe in 5 years, in 10 years, people will begin to appreciate this. I believe that we will have a jurisprudence for the preventive state, but I think my defense of Donald Trump has prevented this from becoming part of the dialogue at current American universities. And
You know,
that
I
is the
wouldn't
worst.
send it to Harvard Law. I would send it to the Senate, and I'd also send it to the justices and maybe the D.C. Circuit, someone who's going to have the ability and the authority to actually act on a
It's a
rational
good idea.
basis to move the law forward, because we have to get Brandenburg doesn't work, New York Times v. Sullivan doesn't work anymore. It was great for the 60s and the 70s. It's not great for the WMD era. And by the way, does Israel have a counterpart to this in their law?
No, Israel does have some restrictions on free speech. In actual practice, they have an enormous amount of free speech, but they don't have a constitution. And all I want to do is start a debate. I'm not sure I know the answer. I want to hear from everybody. I used to want to hear from the American Civil Liberties Union, but the ACLU has become the Anti Civil Liberties Union. They have nothing to say about this, but organizations like FIRE do have something to say about this. I want to hear from all people, from civil libertarians, from free speech advocates. I want that debate to begin. And the preventive state should be pushing us toward having that debate, because we have to be able to prevent and at the same time not deny people the basic rights of free speech.
Alan Dershowitz, thank you for joining me. I'll be back in June. The book will have caught up with me on my travels. The Preventive State is in bookstores now. That's what it looks like if you're watching on the Salem News Channel, if you're listening on the Salem Radio Network. Preventive State, Alan Dershowitz. You cannot miss it. You ought to read it. You ought to be part of the debate going forward. Professor D, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate the time.
They're very, very intelligent questions. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
What? I hope so. It's what I do. Not as long as
Very
you do
well.
it, but it's what I do. Thank you so much.